begin our journey as we engage RIDE during this session today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And to begin with here, I want to share with you a couple ways teams and organizations view diversity. And as I'm going through them, what I'd like you to do is be thinking about how does your team and how does your organization approach diversity, and what can they do to enhance this. So the first approach is more of an equity compliance approach. And this is where people want to kind of comply with their core values, where it's equal treatment, respectful treatment. They want to also comply with the federal EEO requirements, and they want to make sure that they're setting and complying with diversity goals. So again, in this approach, it's kind of very surface level. We realize this is important. We want to make sure that we're enhancing diversity in the organization, but we don't want to engage too deeply in this differences. It's just, hey, let's kind of comply with it and we'll go with it. Now, the advantage of this approach is you're enhancing diversity in your organization and you're meeting and complying with your core values. Now, the next approach research has found is organizations kind of take a utilitarian or a Machiavellian approach. Is we're going to treat people equally, we're going to enhance diversity in the organization, but we use it as a means to an end. For example, if I enhance diversity and I want to go into the Latin American market, if I hire people from Latin American backgrounds, then I'm more apt to be able to engage in those market segments. So again, it's a means to an end. It is more of a Machiavellian, mercenary approach to diversity. But again, you're enhancing diversity in the organization, and those ideas may start to percolate up. And where they engage in the differences and the commonalities is how can we expand into different market segments, reach into different vendors to support the organization. And the third approach to diversity is more of this integration and enrichment. And this is where we want to enhance diversity, but we're also going to engage deeply on what are the commonalities between our people and what are the differences. And more importantly, how can we leverage the different perspectives, the different ideas, and the different experiences in order to enrich the organization, make it a better organization, and more importantly, how can we apply this to the way we operate and enhance the way we operate? So this is kind of an aspirational approach because it's designed to become a better organization, and more importantly, we're going to enhance the way we do business. And this, I'd argue, be where the full inclusion is all voices are heard, and we're working on that to enhance the way we do business. Now, this may be also a developmental journey for teams and organizations where we start out at the compliance level, we start to move into how can we then use the differences in experience in that to capitalize on different market segments, and then we can kind of go into how can we really fully, deeply value and engage the differences and commonalities to enhance who we are as an organization. And more importantly, how do we do business? So those are the three approaches, and it's just something to be thinking about as we're going to go through this framework here, and it may help you also, where can you engage RIDE? And I'm going to turn it over to Jose, and he is going to talk about the RIDE framework.
Thanks a lot, Pat, and thanks again for queuing this up for me and for setting a really great foundation for the rest of our afternoon. Folks, you may be wondering why the name of the program is Engage with RIDE, and that's because that's the framework that we follow now at Wake Forest. I say now because the RIDE framework is new to Wake. I've been at Wake for 3 years now. 1 year as interim CDO, and then the last 2 years as VP for D&I. And one of the things that folks had often asked me was, Jose, what can you do for our organization at Wake Forest? We are made up of academic units and administrative units, and our shop is relatively small. It's only a dozen of us when all is said and done. And what I realized is that we needed to start reframing the question from what can Jose do for diversity and inclusion in my organization to what can you all do for diversity and inclusion within your own organizations. You can imagine at a place with over 50 different majors and over 40 different academic departments, everybody has their own view or lens as to what diversity means or what equity means. You add to that dozens of administrative units, and you get where this tension is for anybody to be the end-all be-all or the catch-all for diversity and inclusion. So RIDE is a framework that we started piloting last September. And through pilots on campus, through what Steve Jobs would call early adopters, may God rest his soul, we've had a lot of folks on campus adopting RIDE over the past 5 or 6 months. And we are now in a place where when Lynn makes this PowerPoint available to you, you will be able to hover over where the underlined RIDE word is, click on that, and go directly to the landing site for the RIDE framework within Wake Forest. My office's email is website was directly below that as well. Thanks for that, appreciate it. But now you know what it is we're following. Before I go to the actual framework, just a heads up. I'm not going to talk about a strategic plan for diversity and inclusion today. Again, it is up to your individual organizations to develop your own strategic plan. So we've been very intentional to call this the RIDE framework. And that is that's what we'll talk about. So next slide. I am a social scientist by birth. I'm a professor of counseling. And so when Pat and I nerd out on Alport or we nerd out on conceptual frameworks, it's because we both see that the world through that lens, through that organizational psychology lens, that social psych lens, that human services lens. And so for those of you familiar with that, this looks like a social ecological framework, right? We start at the individual level, and then we work up to the departmental organizational level and the institutional level as well. And what you'll see are those arrows, which of course means that every one of these 3 levels of the RIDE framework influences the others back and forth. So there's a lot of give and take, if you will. Now, if you'll click on the next button, what you're going to see is how we define the individual level first and foremost. And I'm not going to read to you, but I do need you to pick out those blue words for the individual level, right? The first thing you want to make sure that your organization does at the individual level is that you as the leader and the folks that you are leading and the folks that they are leading, familiarize yourself with the framework and your own targets and your own reasons for why you want to reach that aspirational level of D&I that Pat talked about. The second thing you want to remember is you need to be able to understand your own identity, your own personal biases, and your patterns of exclusion. We all have patterns of exclusion. We've done it as kids, where we sort crayons, or we put the cars with the cars, and we put the dolls with the dolls, and it's just a natural thing that we do. And sometimes there is no harm to the Matchbox cars or the Barbie dolls, but sometimes there are harms, whether you incorrectly group folks in a particular way, or somehow only reserve promotions for a particular group of folks, right? So you have to be able to own up to it and understand those. And then last but not least, for individual level, we all have a level of influence. I'm very keen on not running away from the word privilege, because we all have privilege. Whether or not I identify as Latino, which I do, and whether or not English was my second language, which it was. I have 4 degrees. I've got more degrees than my mom and dad combined over and over again, right? So there's a certain level of privilege that I have. And so how do I use that to influence my organization? How do you use your influence? Those are the 3 different target levels that you want to make sure individuals within your organization can understand. At the organizational level, which is that middle part, which are your individual departments, your individual units, you want to be able to have open, honest, vulnerable conversations. Lately, Brene Brown, and by lately I mean a couple of years, for the past few years, Brene Brown, a sociologist, has been getting a lot of really positive press and reviews on her ability to push leaders in organizations, in the Department of Defense, wherever you can get to be real about the conversations that they have. If you can't have these organizational conversations, you'll never be able to fully get into that aspirational level. You'll do the compliance part, and maybe you'll get the utilitarian, but when groups in your folks, or when folks in your groups are saying, we want to be seen more, we want to be valued more, we want to contribute more, you'll never get to that higher plane, if you will. And the other thing that I'll do, and again, this continues to be a plug for the RIDE framework, is when you get this PowerPoint, you'll be able to click in the all caps underlined RIDE action plan template. If you click on that, that is when you, as an organizational departmental leader, can start to map out the major questions for getting your organization to a place where there is more equity and there is more inclusion and there is more diversity, right? Those are some of the questions that we constantly ask ourselves as we develop those plans. And the plans are blank. You've got a lot of target words, and you've got a lot of questions that will get you to developing your own actions and your own step-by-step plans, but they are for you to develop, right? And so it's important that we can articulate a plan for our organization that many people can see and connect and buy into. So that's the RIDE framework at its most basic levels. This next slide is delving a little bit deeper into the self-assessment. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the commit self-assessment, and if I've learned a lot from Pat in the past couple of months that we've been in cahoots. One of the things that I appreciate from Pat's guidance is, Jose, we need to give people tools that they can use with their teams. The commit self-assessment, which is free, is a 15 to 20 minute assessment max. And it really is the kind of instrument that helps the taker understand a bit more about where their biases and where their strengths are. And so what you want to do is, as an idea, and again, I know we've got a lot of leaders on this call, I would encourage you to do the commit on your own and then see how a tool like that can help individuals within your team grow a bit more into their D&I awareness. These are very important things for you to keep in mind as you respond to this assessment. Before focusing on those around us, focus on yourself. This isn't about your neighbor or your partner or your kids. This is about you. So in that regard, be honest when you take an assessment like this or the commit itself. Always remember, particularly from a diversity and inclusion perspective, these self-assessments are formative. They're not meant to be the end-all be-all. I'm not saying this just to make those of you on the call feel better. When I take some of these, sometimes there's room for growth, and most of the times there's room for a lot of growth. And my scores do change. This isn't like the Myers-Briggs, for those of you that love the Myers-Briggs, where you tend to be pretty static. There are places where you can be dynamic. Last but not least, always room for growth and always room for grace. When you do one of these and you learn, I had more biases than I thought I did, go easy on yourself. I mentioned I was the counselor by training before I did this for a living. And if a counselor is worth anything, it's the ability to tell you to give yourself a little bit of grace and go easy on yourself. So if there are individual tools for self-assessment, there's another round of individual tools that really leads into the RIDE framework very well. And that's for supporting others. Once an individual has gotten a better understanding of who they are, then they can help others understand who they are a bit better. And so if you click on this, you get a very straightforward one-pager from a peer institution where they develop some do's and don'ts on how to be an active bystander. So first of all, what's a passive bystander? A passive bystander is somebody who sees a colleague or a peer or a friend knock somebody down, literally, I mean figuratively, not literally, or maybe literally, and they don't do anything about it, right? In organizations, particularly smaller organizations, those kinds of literal and figurative knockdowns eat away at the core of that individual, which then of course eats away at that organization. And so what we can do as members, as individuals within an organization, is to become a better bystander. So there are many ways to help others. Help requires action beyond words. We've been hearing this over the past couple of months, particularly post the civil unrest after the death of Mr. Floyd and Mr. Arbery and Ms. Taylor. All of these folks are reading the books, and all of these folks are posting on Facebook and Instagram. And what a lot of other folks said, well, okay, so this is great. You're reading a new book. You're posting a new hashtag. Black Lives Now Matter for you. What are the actions behind that, right? And so just make sure that you can link your actions and your words. Actions need to focus on others. This is so important to this work. When you go into that active bystander resource, you won't see a lot of me, 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 me. You'll see a lot more the, or they. You have to be able to focus on other individuals. Focusing on others means listening to them as opposed to getting ready to say something. Pat, I may have said this last time, but lately a good friend of mine reminded me, Jose, it's better to listen to understand than it is to listen to respond. Listening to understand is what this is really about. And to listen, you must be self-aware. So it's got this cyclical kind of circle oh, that's why he's got those circles going on, right? So the next to last slide that I'll speak at before I turn it back over to Pat for a little bit is on the RIDE framework with regards to the culture and the climate. So if you'll click on the next slide, please. Yay, perfect. Okay, so one of the things that you need to think about is once you have checked on the individuals within your organization and your unit and your department, once you've led them and led yourself through some awareness and then action steps, the next logical step, of course, is how do you bring that to your organization? So the culture and the climate that you are getting ready, that you are seeding for your group must be clear, must be understandable, must be transparent to others, knowing that your organization is going to interact constantly, not only with people within it, but of course with people outside of it. Think about your customers, think about your students, think about your clients, think about anyone who might walk into that office, who might visit that website. And so what do you do to not only communicate, but to live into those core values and that purpose and that vision and that goal? So my advice to organizations has always been, once you've done the individual work, figure out a way to promote your values, purpose, vision, and goals. The more you promote your values, purpose, vision, and goals in a way that is visible to others, the safer your climate is. Let me give you an example of this because it's come up a lot at Wake over the past couple of years. Students, faculty, and staff have been asking for Wake Forest to produce a policy that is zero tolerance with regard to white supremacy. A policy that is zero tolerance for white supremacy. Now, that sounds like a really good idea. And for folks who are familiar with freedom of expression, and for folks who are familiar with the nuance folks can manifest in impressive ways, it's a really hard policy to just write up and then, more importantly, hold people accountable. So how we promote an environment that is free of white supremacy and that values people regardless of their backgrounds is by creating a safe climate, or I should say a safer climate. So you sometimes don't have to put something in writing as so much as you have to let others know that the makeup of a group or the mission and vision goals, that is telling me that this is a place that is safe for me. And so by creating that safer climate, directly and indirectly, you invite people in. And you also tell some people that this may not be a place for them. And I mean that in a positive, not a negative. If you are an exclusively minded team member, if you have biases that you care not to check, you don't care about your clients, you may not want that person working in your organization, right? And so this is why this creation of a safe climate is important. Artifacts. What I mean by artifacts is leaders need to engage with this material. Leaders need to engage with RIDE. Thank you, Pat. You need to be able to engage with these tools. And that way, individuals throughout the organization understand that the buy-in is at the top. And the artifacts are the commitments made by the leadership structure. The artifacts are the commitments made by the leadership structure. So I'm about to kick it over back to Pat again, knowing full well that you've been provided not only with a framework, but also with a set of tools that will help your organization be more equitable and more inclusive.
Thank you, Jose. Just to build on what Jose said is at the department and organization level is you want to set the context for the enhancement of diversity and inclusion. And one of the tools we talked about on the last webinar was Elport's contact hypothesis. Again, that is a tool to help set a climate that is safe, and also align the organization around the importance of diversity, inclusion, and equality. I'll just briefly review that for those that weren't on the last webinar. But again, on the contact hypothesis, there's 4 conditions that if leaders set, will set a context to enhance diversity, inclusion, reduce bias, prejudice, and discrimination in their organization. And the first one is norms of equality, and Jose talked about that. Is your core values, your purpose, your strategic goals, your vision, does it embody diversity, inclusion, and equality for all members of the organization? The next one is interdependence, and the key on this one is does everybody in the organization share a collective goal? And when people share a collective goal, they can come together and work for something greater than themselves. So everybody should have a piece of the department or the organization goal, and nobody can win as an individual or only as a team. Everybody has to work together in order to win. And the next one is this sustained close contact. And again, what you want to do is set the organization up, set your processes up to encourage collaboration, to encourage people to work together in a close environment. And when we're working together in a close environment, we're learning about different people, we're learning about the commonalities, we're learning about the differences, how the differences can be leveraged. And so again, we want to make sure that we're setting this up to where we're working together, we're collaborating together. And the last one is this equal status interactions. And this is kind of viewing that team or organizational environment, we're partners. We have opportunities and systems to voice. Our voice is invited in so that it isn't that, somebody is always in the majority group is the one that's always the leaders. We're all interested in all the ideas. We want to be inclusive. We want to get the great ideas. So if we can set those conditions, chances are, to be nice, we'll be reducing the chances of bias, prejudice, and discrimination because it sets a context for people to interact, to work towards common goals, to have venues for voice, and we're living our core values that embrace diversity and inclusion. So that is one department and organization tool to help set the context. And then the other one is don't forget on your culture and climate are really important, but the way your people experience your culture and climate on a daily basis is how you do business, your policies, procedures, practices, structure, and systems. And again, one of them is your strategic management. Is it part of your strategic management and the goals is to enhance diversity, to enhance inclusion in the organization? Your recruitment process, do we have mechanisms to start recruiting talent to make sure that we get the diversity we need? Or are we also recruiting in colleges? Do we have internship programs to where we're starting to recruit underrepresented groups, get them exposed to our organization, and ensure that they are being developed so that they're competitive to join the organization? Our onboarding process. The senior leaders in the department or the organization are the ones that should be talking to all new members, and the discussion should be on the core values, the importance of diversity, and the importance of inclusion. And if there's affinity groups in the organization, that should be outlined there. But again, it is the senior leaders communicating the importance of diversity and inclusion and how is it being implemented and enhanced in the organization, and what's that aspirational vision for the department and the organization. People development system, and again, what you want to do here is make sure that everybody has an opportunity to develop and to be all they can be. Understand that some people, that resources are scarce, but everybody should have some opportunity to continue to develop and to continue to grow. And then the promotion system, and this is tied into the development piece, is we got to make sure that all people have equal access to those key jobs to get promoted. In business, it's P&L leadership. And again, everybody should have that opportunity if they've demonstrated potential to get those key critical jobs that will enable them to be eligible and the likelihood of getting promoted. So again, this ties into our leader development system so that we're setting everybody up for promotion. And then again, are we looking at making sure that we have diversity throughout all levels of our leadership, and we're building a pipeline to make sure people are prepared for it. And then the other one, and you all know this, one of the greatest changers of behavior is if you put diversity, inclusion, support, and goals on the performance management. And you've got a quarterly talk about how you're progressing towards that, how you're integrating that in. And then at the end of the performance management system, incentives are now linked to achieving your diversity inclusion goals, whatever level. It's the team, organizational, business unit. But again, this is an accountability mechanism, and it has a tremendous impact. But again, that'll mean that it'll be measured, leaders will be engaging on it, and chances are those behaviors will be reinforced and changed on it. And I'm going to turn it over to Jose to address the institutional aspect of this model of RIDE.
Thank you, Pat. So we're at the point where we're almost done, and we'll get to answer some questions. And I want to thank Michelle for already putting a question in the chat, which I promise we'll get to. It'll be the first one we get to. One of the things that is important is to think about your institutional goals as looking inward and outward. At an institution like Wake Forest, at a major bank or a community bank for that matter, we know that once we shore up our organizations, our systems, once we make things tidy in the house, it's time to open it up, right? It's time to let others see the good work that we've been doing. And so when you see institutional within the RIDE framework, it actually has a couple of different meanings, right? It's not just for our institution, but the impact that our institution has on the neighborhood and the communities around it. And that's really what this ends up being, right? This institutional commitment to diversity and inclusion isn't just good for the people who live, work, and learn in a particular spot, but it's for all of those who benefit from that living, that working, and that learning. So from an institutional cultural standpoint, leaders should first ask themselves, why is RIDE important to them? And this is interesting because it has a parallel to the individual level of the framework. When things started to get very real over the last few months regarding civil unrest and regarding demonstrations, a lot of folks started to call me and they called Pat. They called probably half of you on this call were reached out to by a colleague. What should I read to come up to speed? What should I do? And I remember at one point saying to myself and saying to a friend who was, somebody I've known forever, why do you want to all of a sudden learn about something or get in touch with something that you had not stopped to think about before? And it stopped that person in their tracks, right? Because what they wanted to say was I wanted to connect with my colleagues, or I wanted to learn about what was going on. But the reason why the question stumped them was because they never had stopped to think for themselves, so why is George Floyd's death relevant to me? Why are diversity metrics relevant to this institution, to this organization, right? And so a leader at any level, whatever level you want to consider yourself a leader at, whether it's the president of the senior class at Mount Tabor High School, or whether it's the CEO of Amazon. Yes, Mr. Bezos, I know you're on this call, right? Regardless of where you see yourself, you need to ask yourself why this is important for your organization. Why is realizing inclusion, diversity, and equity important for your organization? And if you can answer that question from a cores value perspective, you can answer that question from this has always been what we're about, great. If you can only answer that question from the outside, well, it's what our customers want. It's what the Fortune 500 metrics want. It's what the Dow wants. It's what the US News and World Report top rankings for top 30 schools wants. That's not the best reason for doing it, because the minute something changes, whether it's the US News and World Report ranking becomes the Wall Street Journal ranking, or whether it's your customer base that gives up on you, because it was never core for you, because you never asked this question for your institution, it falls flat. So that's the first thing you want to do about thinking about RIDE from an institutional perspective. The second thing that you want to do when it comes to RIDE is, what are your commitments and expectations for senior leaders? For those of you that have a cabinet or board of trustees or board of governors or whatever the board is, this has to be something that your board at the very least understands. I talk a lot about diversity and equity from 3 different levels: awareness, empathy, and acceptance. People need to be aware as to why these things are important. And if it helps them understand, that's even better. And I don't need you to accept my reality. It'd be great if you did. Maybe I might accept yours, but that's aspirational. At the very least, we need to be aware and understand. So your board members, your senior cabinet members, they may not all be gung-ho about D&I the way that, no offense, Pat, I'm not gung-ho about margins, even though you're not the margins guy. I know you're not the accounting guy, Pat. But it's okay that I'm not nuts about margin calls the same way that my colleagues aren't totally crazy about D&I, right? But I understand the importance of margin calls, and my colleagues understand the importance of diversity and inclusion, right? They're not just aware, but they also understand it. So your commitment and your expectations as senior leaders around diversity and inclusion are paramount. And you hear this from students, from our colleagues who maybe are entry level or right above that. What's the senior leadership say about diversity and inclusion? Does the president know? Does the board chair know? Does the senior VP know what our metrics are? And if they do, and if they can articulate it, whoa, I actually feel seen. I actually feel heard. Going back to Pat's previous slide about performance and incentive, I've now been incentivized to give all I can for this organization. And by the way, Pat, it's great if it's a raise, but it's also great if it's being seen and being heard, right? That morale has a really, really great synergy with performance. But if it's not communicated, if the commitments and the expectations aren't there from senior leaders, it's just talk. So I'm gonna go chat that now or Instagram that. And the next thing you know, you're not where you wanna be. Last thing is benchmarks. I've always been really, really upfront with benchmarks. To me, particularly right out of the gate, if this is not something the organization has typically done, it's okay to set not low benchmarks, but achievable benchmarks, right? Every now and again, somebody will say to me, Jose, can we achieve 60% domestic students of color at Wake Forest? We can achieve anything we want. That's gonna be really, really, really hard to do. You know what's better? If we can set something that we can achieve and build upon. But the reality here is we don't oftentimes set benchmarks. So my point for any institution is, can you get in the culture of setting benchmarks? And then more importantly, can you share those benchmarks? Can you share progress towards those benchmarks? Nowadays, the word dashboard is as synonymous as the word hamburger. Everyone's got a dashboard for something. Do you have a dashboard for D&I? And this isn't a yes or no or maybe, it's a question. The actual development of a dashboard for D&I may be your first benchmark. Oh, Jose, but we don't know if we want to get the word out of where we are and what our percentage is. Guess what? People probably already know what your benchmarks are and what your numbers are and what your percentages are. But having a benchmark of transparency might be a really, really good place to start. So that is how the institutional rung, if you will, of the RIDE framework works. Now, before we get to our Q&A session, I've got one more slide, and then Pat's got one more slide, and then we'll be done. Pat already queued it up and said that if you came to our last one, you had heard of Alport. Well, if you came to our last one, you've heard of this. But I will tell you, even if you have heard it already, I really am trying to stress this, this idea of reframing the work for people around organizations, whether it's academic or whether it's business oriented, because I really do think it's important. I feel we need to change the narrative on diversity work. I feel we need to change the words from time to time. And in this day and age, where a lot of things can either cause consternation or cause people to wonder, I don't know what they're talking about, here's my challenge. Over the last X number of decades, we've been using the words diversity, inclusion, and equity. And we don't use them synonymously because we do know that diversity and inclusion and equity are different. But I challenge those on this call to start rethinking about this, particularly if you think you don't know much about D&I. Wrong. We all know about D&I. Number one, Diversity is compliance. Diversity is compliance simply means that that is the bare minimum you can do. And so it's important to know that you have reached certain metrics. It's important to know that you are going to commit yourself to certain percentages of your customer base or your clientele base or your colleague base. But at the end of the day, we know that compliance isn't enough, right? So inclusion is consciousness. When you reach inclusion, you reach a certain level of consciousness where all of a sudden you're like, wow, I didn't know that. I didn't know how important that was. I didn't know how important that was to my colleague. That is so, that's so important. Great. But we can't stay at a level of consciousness. Otherwise, we'd either have no degrees or our kids would never move out of their house. Our oldest is 13. Please may it be one day, not too soon, but soon can't come enough, right? That is the level of consciousness. So the last part is commitment. People throw the word around a lot. Equity, 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 equity. We want to be more equitable. We want to present more equity. That's great. You can't be equitable if you're not committed to the work. And so if it's easier for you to put your hand over the diversity and inclusion and equity boards and just look at this work as compliance, consciousness, and commitment, always knowing to build up, you will realize inclusion, diversity, and equity within your organization. And of course, last but not least, if you're going to do all this work, if you're going to comply, if you're going to increase consciousness, and if you're going to knock it out of the park with commitment, communicate. Communicate in a way that people who work for you and with you and want to be part of your organization, they know that this is an organization that cares about the community and cares about the environment and cares about people around it. But if you don't communicate it, they'll never know that. And I know there's a give and take. Like I said, I'm a counselor. Counselors don't typically come off as being braggadocious or bragging or conceited. But there is a fine line between saying nothing and saying everything. Find that line that you're comfortable with, but don't forget to communicate your good work around these three areas. Pat?
All right, Jose. And then just kind of wrapping up benefits of diversity and inclusion. And again, you recruit and retain good people, especially the younger generations. They're looking at this and they want to make sure that you are an open, welcoming organization. It establishes a culture for everybody in your organization to reach their full potential and have it developed. Encourages innovation through collaborative synergy. And again, if you're going to get this, if you bring differences in, focus on commonalities. There may be some friction, have positive ways to work through it. But the key thing is leverage those different experiences, the different viewpoints, and the different perspectives to enhance your organization and enhance the way you do business. And again, for an organization, this is that aspirational aspect. Set the example for all your stakeholders, both internal and external. And it's also a way to attract clients and customers. And it'll enhance your performance. And as Jose said, it'll enrich the communities that you do business in or that you serve in. So again, there is a business case for the benefits of diversity and inclusion. And then to close us up, just upcoming for the Legacy Center, and this is part of diversity inclusion, and Jose talked about having a safe environment, but it's allowing voice and to have this different voices heard. So John Sumath is going to be doing a session on that on the 10th of September at noon. Jose and I will do part 3 of our series on the 30th of September at noon. So if you want to mark your calendar, and Len will send an invite out for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to questions and answers. I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to go to gallery view here. And so Len, if you got them on the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute and ask your question, we're here to answer your questions.
Okay, we have a couple in chat. The
Please.
first was referenced by Jose from Michelle. The question is for both you, Pat, and Jose, regarding active bystanders. How might we be a good active bystander, but also balance that with given thoughtful consideration, which might take time, how to best approach a situation in a healthy manner for the group? And she's thinking more sensitive issues that require reflection.
Okay.
Thanks, Michelle. Pat, you want me to take that one?
Yeah, why don't you do it, and I'll follow up with you, because we have a technique we use in the School of Business.
Oh, okay, great. All right. So this is the non-business school technique. So Michelle, what I would say is the first thing that you want to make sure is if you're going to be an active bystander and you want to engage and you want to support, the more knowledgeable and comfortable you are with the topic in question, the more you will just lean in, the more genuine you'll be, the more respectful you'll be, right? Now, I appreciate that you added the caveat regarding more sensitive issues that require reflection. So here's the trick. There are a couple of things I know about, and there are thousands of things that I don't know about, right? I've seen examples, if you will, when Asian students have been targeted by non-Asian students. And the first couple of times I saw it happen, Michelle, I did not know what to say, right, in a previous role. But what I did know is that, and I had no rapport, no connection with the student. But what I did do is after the event had ended, in other words, I did not intervene in the middle of it. I asked the student if I could bother them for a couple of minutes, and then owning into my own ignorance and lack of awareness, inquired. So did I read that well, that you felt negative or you felt hurt or you felt oppressed or whatever the word might have been, Michelle? And then after that dialogue and engaging that student, offering my support and letting them know how grateful I was that they'd informed me, I ended up being more informed so that the next time I saw something like that happen, I was able to engage. If this is an organization and it's somebody you know, maybe it's a new member to a team, maybe you don't want to jump in and be the Batman or the Robin or the Wonder Woman and jump into the fray every single time. But I think we're all well aware enough, or at least attentive enough to know when something is not going right. And so the first couple of times, I would say you might want to talk to that person after the fact. If it's once you know what you're seeing, Michelle, once you know that is sexism, or that is oppressive, or that is xenophobia, or that is homophobia, or that is anti-Semitism, once you're like, okay, I know what that is, then you yourself will feel that it's less sensitive, not because it isn't, but because you're not as sensitive to it as you used to be. That is what I would argue. It's going to take a little bit of time, but at some point, you don't need to be on the sidelines anymore. And I think you'll know when that is, when that moment presents itself. So what's the business angle, my friend?
And Jose, we can go a little bit more depth on the next session, but what we do is we have a format for challenging conversations. We call it BIC. And really it is, you focus on behavior, the impact on you, what you'd like to see change, and then invite the person in the conversation. And ideally, depending if it's blatant and something, you may, like Jose say, engage immediately. If not, you may want to get the individual in their office or off to the side and just point out the behavior, what was the potential impact on you or the team, and then invite them in on the conversation. And you may have found a blind spot that they're not aware of, that this term or whatever can be offensive to people. And by pointing it out and bringing them in on the conversation, you're starting a dialogue. But the more you can do it, it builds the efficacy that you're engaging the person, you're not attacking them, and you're just pointing out that this is the behavior, its impact on me, I own this, and this is what we'd like to see going forward. So again, it's kind of engaging in that dialogue to where you can kind of have conversations, raise the awareness that, hey, this may be a blind spot. I didn't realize that this could be taken as offensive. And so we'll go more in depth on that on the 30th, that tool, and you'll get exposed to that tool and to enhance that.
Okay, next question is going back to Jose's comments about the difficulty around zero tolerance for white supremacy. If we want to create a culture where we're open to hearing different, even unpopular perspectives, how do we differentiate between hurtful or hateful perspectives and simply unpopular or dissenting perspectives? Second part is, how do we balance being open to all employees' opinions while protecting the safety and inclusive culture that we want to support?
Thanks, Lynn. So for me, the answer to both of those questions starts with listening and being able to be attentive to the needs of your of your team. I understand, as most of us on this call do, that there are certain inalienable rights regarding freedom of expression and regarding free speech. And at the same time, if not only one, and even if it is one, but particularly if it's more than one, more than one person, more than one setting, if folks within that team are starting to say, not only am I offended by this term or by this imagery or by this action, it is hurting me, it is worrying me, it is making me feel uncomfortable, it is scaring me. There has got to be a way for an organization, a small team, a project group to have that discussion, right? Nobody is saying that you can't say that within your own home. Nobody is saying that you can't fly a particular pendant within your own house. But places of work, places of learning, places where other people from other different backgrounds congregate are places where we need to figure out a social compact, if you will, of how we are going to engage as a team. And so when we have spaces where you have colleagues or you have customers that have told you, we don't want to see this anymore. And it's not just because we don't like it. Like, these symbols or these images or these words are tied to violence and racism and death and sexism and concentration camps. But there's a line there that I think we need to be attentive to. So it's a more complex answer, and I get that. And I know we're running short on time, which is exactly what Pat said. We're going to breeze through these questions before you know it. But I do think there comes a time and a place in any organization, whether it's public or private, to say, we've heard from enough members of our team. They can no longer work here. They can no longer thrive here. They are no longer valued here. And those are not core values for this institution.
And I would just add, as Jose said, is the behavior component of this is what, if somebody's engaging in behavior that it does not support diversity, inclusion, or equity, as leaders, we'll engage in that and stop it. But understanding that a lot of times that behavior, that discriminative behavior, is a result of a prejudice or a negative attitude towards a certain group, which people learn. And there's got to be a space to where you can kind of share different perspectives and experience in a safe environment and engage. And this is where a lot of education programs come in. And Jose mentioned this empathy. It's perspective sharing, is to see and understand people's different viewpoints and kind of talk about it. And it's important for leaders to really reinforce and emphasize how the behavior, if we're supporting diversity, inclusion, and equity, how that's enhancing the organization, how that's enhancing everybody's ability to work. But there's got to be a way to kind of talk about different perspectives, because everybody comes from different backgrounds. And education is the key to kind of getting around and reducing these biases, the prejudice, and the negative behavior that results from it. Jose, you want to add anything to that?
That's great, Pat. I know we got a couple more questions, so we can probably talk about this for another 3 hours. So we'll see what else we got.
Next question is from Ava. As a Black American, it sometimes seems that the word diversity and all the many different ways we can be diverse is sometimes used to water down or back away from dealing with cultural characteristics and practices in the organization that are based in white supremacy. White supremacy, racism, period, is very difficult for many people to deal with and makes people very uncomfortable. So diverting attention to other forms of diversity, such as age, background, or other ethnic groups, makes folks less uncomfortable. How do you discourage and address that retreat to the comfort zone?
So, Ava, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If not, let me know in the chat box and I'll fix the enunciation. I think your question is exactly how to discourage and address that retreat to those comfort zones. And I'm not trying to, throw sunshine your way. I'm being genuine, because to pose this question at a team level or a project level or an institutional level is exactly to do that, to jar the person, or at least to nudge the person who thinks, "Whew, I'm good." I'm like, actually, we're not good. We've heard this term a couple of years ago. The diversity of thought became a term, a more popular term, and it became such a popular term that the former chief diversity officer at Apple used the term diversity of thought. And she ended up resigning from that position shortly after, which was unfortunate because I thought she was a great CDO and a great chief human resource officer beforehand. We are in a different time now than we were 2 years ago when she left her post. We have to do something with the environment that we find ourselves in, with the social unrest and the demonstrations and the call to action that we find ourselves in. And if all of a sudden, companies who 2 months and 1 week ago weren't having these kind of conversations, now, all of a sudden, 2 months ago, and my timing's off, but I think you know what I'm talking about. There are these pivotal moments in our society that what we weren't doing or talking about, all of a sudden we are, right? We use this example a lot in higher ed. If NASCAR can all of a sudden denounce the Confederate flag, then we are now in a space where we can have more of these uncomfortable conversations. Here's the only thing I would offer, Ava. If you're going to challenge your team by, again, literally posting this question, I would make sure that there is space for reflection after. On a college campus, when we do broach topics like this, we work in conjunction with the counseling center to make sure that we've got somebody to debrief, or the chaplain's office, so we have somebody to debrief. I understand it doesn't work that way in every single organization, but there may be an office of inclusion, or there may be a human resources office, so that you're willing not only to have the conversation, but to support the aftermath of that conversation. And I don't mean aftermath like a hurricane or a tsunami. I mean aftermath like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I was racist. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that was sexist. All right, we're gonna help you process that, but we're not gonna help you bury that. And we're not gonna help you ignore that. I love this. I know Lynn makes copies of our chat boxes, and Ava, if it's okay with you, I'd like to use this at a future date and time on how to have these conversations, just with that.
Okay. Last question. And after this question, if there are further questions, please unmute yourself as Pat suggested earlier. But from Jenna, what do the expectations look like for leaders and all employees to ensure all are adopting the framework appropriately and examining themselves, the department, and then the institution?
Jenna, if you're asking about the RIDE framework, I'll give you 30 seconds. If you're asking of any framework, I'm going to let Pat go next. So here's my answer to that. In our office, Jenna, we've got 2 individuals who basically are shepherding the RIDE framework throughout the institution. The first thing that we need to ensure is that we resource the institution. So if you go to that RIDE link on slide 3 or 4, you'll see our toolkit. Every single section of all 3 areas of the framework have a toolkit, so that we've resourced everyone with things that they can do to build their own template. The second thing that I would say with regards to how do you hold the institution accountable, Dr. Hatch, our president, has been talking about RIDE since it went live on June the 9th, and consistently reminding his VPs, of which I am one, we need more metrics. We need a cohesive communication plan and voice on this. And so it's this notion of expectation. If the leadership has adopted it and has given it to their VPs and their deans, then the expectation is by the end of this academic year, 2020/2021, we will all have RIDE frameworks in the books, if you will. The harder part is the ensuring. So just because I put a plan in someplace, how do I ensure? And that's what my office is there to do. So we follow a consultative model where once your plan is developed, we continue to provide updates and resource. Here's the one thing though, at the end of the day, I am assured that the organization holds itself accountable. You don't want to be the one department without a RIDE plan or without a diversity and inclusion plan. Just like you don't want to be the one department without a profitability plan, right? I mean, we start talking about these things the same way, then people just think about it rotely, like, oh, I've got my targets, my sales targets for the year, and I've got my D&I targets for the year as well. That's how we're doing it.
I would just add, for organizations, this is a cultural enhancement. You want to embed this into the DNA of the organization. I'd go through a formal culture change plan and walk through it and the mechanisms you use to shape culture. That way, it'll cascade down. And remember on that, it's planned at the upper level, but it's grassroots and you're getting feedback up. So everybody in the organization's involved in it. And it's a formal process. And remember, it's designed to enrich and enhance the organization and take that aspirational aspect. Lynn, any other questions? I know we're at the hour time limit.
Yeah, I think we're up to date. And Mercy, thank you for your appreciation for the discussion. If there's follow-up questions, we could take those quickly, but I know that several of you have emailed me on the side requesting the slides. We will get those to you, and this is being recorded, so as soon as that is whatever happens to it, compressed or whatever, that will be shared and posted on our website.
Sounds great. And Jose and I will stay on, so that'll be the end of the formal session. If you have questions, we'll be happy to stay on a few minutes and answer any of your individual questions. So thank you all for attending. Greatly appreciate the engagement and the questions.